W. Bush. Among those steps, we created and expanded the renewable fuel standard under the Clean Air Act. Our goals included providing new economic opportunity for our farmers, while also lowering our dependence on foreign oil and reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the fuel we burn in our cars and our trucks and vans. Since the implementation of the program, we've come a long way toward achieving our goals. Economic growth in agricultural communities has expanded, and our fuels have become significantly cleaner than they were 2 decades ago. In fact, the renewable fuel standard presents economic and energy opportunities for people in Delaware and every other state to seize. Like many of our colleagues on this committee, I still support the goals of the renewable fuel standard. Having said that, there have been a number of challenges when it comes to the implementation of the program, as we know. For example, the amount of advanced renewable fuels used today in this country is far less than 36 billion gallons that Congress and the President mandated in 2007 to be used by 2022. That shortfall is partly due to unforeseen market challenges, and it's partly due to EPA's delay in approving new fuels to enter the marketplace. But make no mistake, advanced renewable fuels are being produced that have the potential to replace gasoline, diesel, and jet fuels on a gallon-for-gallon basis in today's combustion engines with no loss of performance. Many of these advanced fuels have already been approved for use in state renewable fuel programs in states like Oregon. However, EPA has been slow to make decisions on new advanced biofuel applications and pathways for usage. At the same time, the Clean Air Act prohibits some of the advanced renewable fuels that qualify for state programs from qualifying as renewable fuel under the federal program. We must find better ways to allow new advanced renewable fuels to qualify for the renewable fuel standard. And doing so would be good for our environment. It would help refineries meet their obligations and further support a growing domestic biofuel industry. Another challenge in implementing the renewable fuel standard is the volatility in compliance costs for refineries. Years of mismanagement under the previous administration, coupled with the unexpected changes in both fuel supply and demand caused by the pandemic, have collectively wreaked havoc on the program's compliance market, known as the RIN market, R-I-N market. What is the RIN market? EPA tracks compliance with the renewable fuel standard by using tradable credits referred to as a renewable identification number, or RINs. Refiners and importers can generate RINs either by blending biofuels into fuel or by purchasing RINs from another party through what is known as the RIN market. The huge price swings in RIN costs from 30 cents to almost $2 per gallon of renewable fuel in less than 2 years have created financial uncertainty for just about everybody, especially those who are required to comply with the renewable fuel standard. That, in turn, has made it extremely difficult for obligated parties to make forward-thinking investments in producing cleaner fuels. I'm going to sneeze. Maybe not. Maybe not. All right. We must, excuse me, we must help reduce the volatility in compliance costs for this program to be successful. As recovering governor, when exploring ways to improve federal policies, I oftentimes look to see what's working in our states, the laboratories of democracy, and see if we can replicate some of them. Many states like California, like Oregon, have implemented technology-neutral low-carbon fuel standards. And these standards have successfully advanced cleaner fuel usage, kept consumer and compliance costs low, all while fostering local clean fuel investments and job creation. As we will hear today, these state programs have fuel flexibilities, long-term predictability, and cost containment provisions that are not included in the renewable fuel standards today, but maybe they should be. In closing, as one of the strongest supporters of electric vehicles in the Senate, I know it's important to remember that we aren't yet in a post-liquid fuel world. We must retain our domestic capabilities to produce and refine the motor vehicle fuels that power our lives while also ensuring that these fuels are as clean as possible in order to meet our climate goal. And we look forward to hearing from our witnesses today, but before we do that, let me turn to Senator Capito, who's off of the DL, off the disabled list, after a very brief stay there. Happy you're back and looking great. You're recognized for your opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's nice to be back in the nation's capital, so I appreciate that. I want to thank you for calling today's hearing, and I also want to thank our witnesses for joining us here today. The Renewable Fuel Standard, as the Chairman defined it, known as RFS, is an important topic that our committee, but we haven't had that hearing since 2016. So I think the long gap between hearings sort of speaks to the intricacies of the program, but it's the fact that the potential fault lines between opponents, supporters, and would-be reformers do not always align between one party or another. For my part, there are a few issues I would like to cover today during this hearing. Small refinery exemptions is one, changes to the program coming in the year 2022, and the need for accountability from EPA's Office of Air, including the need for a nominee to head it. I'd like to highlight my concern about the two actions that the EPA recently announced. First, in December, the agency proposed an all-time high renewable volume obligation for 2022 that does not really reflect, I don't think, market realities, and I'll be interested to hear what our panel has to say about that. I'm concerned that this volume obligation is going to raise costs at a time where gasoline is high in and of itself, impacting American consumers and the economy. Second, also in December, EPA also announced a proposal to deny all pending small refinery exemptions, which provide critical relief to small refineries experiencing financial hardship that is imposed by the RFS program. This action runs counter to the congressional intent under the Clean Air Act. EPA's proposed action will negatively impact Ergon, a small refinery located in northern West Virginia. Ergon has already won 2 court cases in the Fourth Circuit, finding that the EPA acted in an arbitrary and capricious manner in denying its small refinery exemption petition. But Ergon is just one of a number of small refineries around the country that have petitions pending before the EPA. This unprecedented and drastic step to propose a blanket denial of outstanding small refinery hardship position is especially puzzling as we see increasing gasoline prices and several small refinery closures around the nation, eliminating good-paying jobs in some of our rural communities as well. Ultimately, this proposal will only lead to more litigation and increased uncertainty under the RFS, with American consumers bearing the costs amid already record-high inflation. I've urged EPA to reconsider its proposal to provide much-needed relief for small refineries and the families and businesses being harmed by elevated fuel costs. I look forward to hearing more from our witnesses on this issue. Next, I'd like to touch on an issue that I believe many of us agree upon, and that is that our liquid fuels, and the chairman touched on this, are still very, very important. I can tell you firsthand, liquid fuel is not going away anytime in my state of West Virginia. Forcing a single technology approach, such as insisting on 100% electric vehicles, disregards the important fact that different communities and businesses have different needs for transportation solutions. It may be true that electric vehicle sales are slowly but surely increasing, but liquid fuel is not used exclusively in passenger vehicles. It's also important for heavy-duty trucks and our airplanes, to name a few. So one issue I'd like to hear about today is how important are liquid fuels, and do you think liquid fuels are going away anytime soon? This conversation on liquid fuel is especially important as the RFS program enters a new phase next year. When Congress enacted the RFS annual volumes were included for the calendar years 2006 through 2022. But after 2022, EPA has the power to determine the annual volume amounts. And the chairman pointed out that we're not even hitting the amounts that we're supposed to be hitting as it is now. EPA is expected to issue a rule to do just that sometime this year. However, I have concerns about how EPA plans to take action on this program without anyone in a Senate-confirmed role in the office that handles the RFS program. The Office of Air and Radiation at EPA, this is the office that is in charge of air emissions and climate issues. It handles the renewable fuel standard and many other complex regulatory programs. Yet, we have been waiting for more than a year for the administration and the president to name a nominee to that office. I've talked about this more than once in our committees. Instead, Principal Deputy Administrator Joe Goffman has served as the lead political official in the office in regular communication with his former boss, the climate czar in the White House, Gina McCarthy. No incoming administration has waited this long to send up a nominee for this critical position since its creation. The previous record was 260 days set by President Clinton. If EPA is deciding important actions related to the future of the RFS program, the administration needs to send up an Office of Air and Radiation nominee who can be accountable to Congress. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
Thank you very much for those comments. Now we're going to turn to our esteemed panel of witnesses in a couple of minutes, and we'll hear from them in this order. First, Coie Wind, the Clean Fuels Program Manager at the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. Second, we'll hear from Emily Score, Chief Executive Officer of Growth Energy. Third, we're going to hear from Lucian Pugliaresi. All right. Would you repeat Lucian, would you just say your name for us?
Lucian Pugliaresi.
Lucian, the P is silent?
Yes.
It really is. All right, Lucian. All right, Pugliaresi. Thank you. Next, the president of the Energy Policy Research Foundation. And finally, last but not least, we're going to hear from Leanne Johnson-Koch, partner at Perkins Coie. Before witnesses begin their testimony, I will turn it over to our colleague, Senator Merkley, to introduce one of our witnesses. Senator Merkley, the floor is yours. Thank you for this.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member Capito and fellow committee members for today's hearing looking at the renewable fuel standard. As we look around the world at all the visible and measurable signs of global climate change, we need to adopt cleaner forms of energy and end our dependence on carbon-emitting fossil fuels. It's plain to see, and I believe we have an incredible opportunity to reduce emissions by electrifying our cars and trucks. The investments we made in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, as well as the ones we want to make in Build Back Better, are important steps toward that goal. But there is no doubt that sustainable liquid fuels are going to play an important role for years to come as we strive to tackle the challenge of global climate chaos. Not all of the solutions are going to start with the federal government. We're going to see states innovate, and we need to learn from them. And this is something we've recognized back home in Oregon, as year after year we confront fiercer wildfires, devastating our forests, historic droughts, devastating our ranching and farming communities, and having a huge impact on the health of our lakes and streams, and acidifying oceans that is wreaking havoc on our sea life off the Oregon coast, and certainly on our fishing community. So Oregon has stepped up to do more through the Oregon Clean Fuels program. Since it began almost 6 years ago, it's a resounding success. Through this program, our state has reduced a significant amount of greenhouse gas emissions from transportation fuels and put us on track to meet our goal of a 10% reduction within the next 3 years. I think that the success we had back home in Oregon can and ought to help inform the discussion for our nation regarding the federal fuels policy. Oregon stands as an example of the fact that a low-carbon fuel standard can work in the transportation sector, which is why I'm delighted to introduce my fellow Oregonian, previously from Hawaii, but now many decades in Oregon, Ms. Coie Wind, the manager of the Oregon Clean Fuels Program. She is a proud graduate of Oregon State University with a degree in bioresources engineering. She has been an integral member of Oregon's Department of Environmental Quality for almost 3 decades, working the last 12 of them in fuels and transportation and climate policy. As the head of the Clean Fuels Program, Ms. Wind is responsible for coordinating between the state, fuel importers affected by the regulations and the clean fuels industry to ensure that everyone has the tools and technical assistance necessary to transform our fuel market. She works to ensure that our rules and regulations align with those of neighboring states, certainly Washington and California, to help make sure that the states along the West Coast are moving in the same direction. So I'm thrilled that she is with us today through the miracle of electronics, that to share her experiences about what has worked in Oregon and how those successes can be implemented on a larger scale. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Markley, very much. And now we're going to begin our witness testimony, and we're going to start off with Ms. Nguyen, and I'm going to ask you to please proceed with your statement. If you are ready, go right ahead.
Hey, good morning, Chair Carper, Ranking Member Capito, and members of the committee. For the record, my name is Corianne Wind, and I work for the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality as the Oregon Clean Fuels Program Manager. Thank you for the invitation to speak to you today about the Oregon Clean Fuels Program, which is Oregon's version of the Low Carbon Fuel Standard. I'd also like to thank at this time Senator Markley for that very nice introduction and for your continued leadership in addressing the climate crisis. So the Clean Fuels Program is one of Oregon's most successful statewide policies for addressing the state's contribution to global climate change. The program began in 2016, and thus far, the program's success and progress can be summarized in three distinct outcomes. So first, the companies that are producing biofuels are making those fuels more cleanly and delivering them in greater volumes to Oregon. The carbon intensity of the ethanol and biodiesel that Oregon uses has decreased, and we've seen significant increases in the blending of biodiesel and renewable diesel in recent years. Renewable forms of diesel, natural gas, propane, and electricity have all entered the Oregon market since the beginning of the program and have emerged as commercially viable and cost-effective replacements of their fossil versions. Electricity will become increasingly important as the new regulations and incentives for vehicles and infrastructure are implemented. And all of these fuels have played an important role in reducing about 6 million tons of life cycle greenhouse gas emissions so far and displacing over 1 billion gallons of fossil fuels in Oregon. Second, the transition from fossil fuels to biofuels and electricity is reducing tailpipe emissions in Oregon and improving the public health of Oregonians. In addition to reducing greenhouse gases, low carbon fuels also emit less carbon monoxide, nitrogen oxides, and particulate matter compared to fossil fuels. And reducing these pollutants have saved Oregonians millions of dollars in avoided health costs over the years. And this is especially important for Oregon's historically overburdened communities that are located near transportation corridors, multimodal facilities, and distribution hubs. And third, the program has spurred innovation and investment without impacting the price at the pump. The program has fostered a $100 billion a year plus market where investments are being made to increase the production of lower carbon fuels, spark new innovations in technology, and invest in infrastructure to deliver these fuels across the state. These investments have allowed the transition from fossil products to cleaner fuels to happen without any significant rise in retail or wholesale prices when compared to our neighboring states, even those that do not have similar fuel regulations. And in fact, the program has lowered the cost of many low carbon fuels, and it has created a powerful financial incentive to decarbonize the transportation sector. So the Clean Fuels Program that we have created in Oregon takes the best parts of the renewable fuel standards and combines it with the best parts of a low carbon fuel standard. So the renewable fuel standard creates the base demand for biofuels that are needed to begin the transition to lower carbon fuels. And the low carbon fuel standards ensures that the lowest of the low carbon fuels comes to Oregon. Participants can stack the value of the credits from the renewable fuel standard with the credits from the low carbon fuel standard, as both are necessary to provide the necessary incentives to fuel providers to continue to lower their carbon intensities. The market also benefits from the long-term certainty from the low carbon fuel standard programs that have established targets through 2030. And Oregon is currently in a rulemaking that will extend its targets and establish standards through 2035. But we have not done this alone. Oregon has benefited greatly from being a signatory to the Pacific Coast Collaborative. So since 2013, British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, and California have worked together to harmonize best practices for policy alignment, program design, and implementation to create the largest market for cleaner, low-carbon fuels on the West Coast. And this collaboration has grown to other states that are now also looking for smart strategies to reduce transportation emissions, ones that can build off of strong federal support of the agriculture and biofuels industry, zero-emission vehicle standards, and investments in electric vehicle charging and alternative vehicle fueling infrastructure. So that concludes my testimony for today. I'm happy to take any questions that you might have. Thank you again for the invitation to be here.
We're delighted that you're here. Thank you so much. I like to say, find out what works, do more of that. And sometimes those states come up with some pretty good ideas that we would benefit from. So thank you very much for your testimony. Next, we're going to hear from Ms. Coie. Ms. Coie, please proceed. Thanks so much for joining us. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you, Chairman Carper, Ranking Member Capito, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I'm Emily Score, CEO of Growth Energy, the world's largest biofuel trade association. The RFS remains the nation's most successful clean energy policy, yet its full potential as a climate solution remains untapped. For the past 8 years, a lack of accountability and failure to comply with the law has slowed progress in carbon reductions. But today, as Congress looks to immediately reduce the carbon intensity of our nation's transportation fleet, it is imperative that biofuels like ethanol, the most affordable and abundant source of low-carbon, high-octane fuel on the planet, are part of our transportation mix now and into the future. Let me be clear, there is no path toward net zero emissions by 2050 without biofuels. 98% of the cars on the road today use liquid fuels, and EIA projects that gasoline or flex fuel-powered vehicles will dominate new vehicle sales through 2050. We can achieve progress on carbon reductions with today's infrastructure, today's vehicles, and a homegrown supply chain through a robust and binding renewable fuel standard and acceleration toward nationwide year-round use of lower-cost biofuels like E15. To date, the RFS has reduced almost 1 billion metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions. Expanded use of low-carbon biofuel cuts emissions and air pollution, drives energy innovation and economic growth, creates biomanufacturing jobs, and lowers gas prices for American drivers. But since 2013, the RFS has consistently been undermined through the abuse of waivers, small refinery exemptions, and compliance deadline extensions. Most of these administrative actions have been to appease the unfounded claims of a select few looking to subvert the RFS, slowing progress on carbon reductions. EPA's recent proposals, delayed as they are, right some of these wrongs. They include the required 15 billion gallons of conventional biofuel in 2022, a long overdue remedy for EPA's unlawful 2016 general waiver, and an end to the abuse of small refinery exemptions. Despite these positives, EPA takes a major step backward by seeking to reduce the 2020 blending obligations finalized 2 years ago. This retroactive change exceeds the agency's authority and creates market disruption and uncertainty. EPA needs to fix and finalize the proposals as soon as possible. Looking forward to achieve our shared clean energy goals, we need year-round access to higher blends of ethanol like E15. Nationwide, E15 would slash CO2 emissions by more than 17 million tons, support more than 180,000 new jobs, and save consumers more than $12 billion in annual fuel costs. Unfortunately, refiners successfully sued to prevent E15 from being sold in the summer throughout much of the country. Not only have they deprived consumers of a lower-cost fuel, they eliminated an easy path for their own RFS compliance. Without immediate action, consumers will lose access to their most affordable fueling option on June 1, when Americans drive the most. Congress and EPA must restore market access so drivers can save up to 10 cents per gallon every time they fuel up with E15. In addition to reducing emissions in light-duty vehicles, biofuels are poised to play a greater role in decarbonizing other forms of transportation. And biorefineries are already deploying carbon capture and wind and solar energy and incentivizing sustainable farming practices, all to drive further innovation and further reductions in our carbon intensity. We see promise in new and emerging low-carbon fuel markets in hard-to-electrify sectors like aviation, marine, and heavy-duty vehicles. To lead our nation through a clean energy transition, we must have a healthy and thriving biofuel industry. We must have a strong and growing RFS. We must move toward E15 as the nation's standard fuel. Don't be fooled. The RFS does not harm refiners. 3 administrations and the courts have affirmed this. Claims to the contrary are just a smokescreen to divert attention away from clean, affordable American energy. Undermining the RFS and delaying the rollout of E15 means increasing gas prices for American consumers, period. Gas prices are driven by the price of crude, not the cost of the RFS. America's farmers and biofuel producers are ready to work with the administration and Congress to restore E15 and put the RFS back on track. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, thanks very much for joining us and for your testimony. Mr. Pugliese, I got another shot at your name. I think I'm getting close to getting it right. All right, thanks. You're recognized. Please proceed.
Please, could we cue up the charts, please? All right. So, Chairman Carper, Ranking Member Capito, members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity to make some comments on the EPA's Renewable Fuel Standard and their management of the program. I'm President of the Energy Policy Research Foundation. We've been around since 1944. I also want to thank EPRINC's Senior Director, Max Pizzier, for helping me with the testimony and the preparation of the charts. I guess the first thing I'd like to say is that in all our work over the years, and we testified here actually in 2016, we have always said that biofuels, and particularly ethanol, represent a very important component of the fuel supply for the U.S. It's a very cost-effective way to get octane and to extend the supply. Our basic criticism of the program is not with biofuels, it's with the mandate. So let's go to the first chart. As you can see in the first chart, and Chairman Carper talked about this already, we are not hitting the original targets of the Energy Security Act. In fact, there's a lot of reasons for that. And you can see now we're about $20 billion against the initial proposed target of 36. The basic reason we're not hitting the targets is because our expectations were wrong, right? There's a lot of uncertainty in the future of oil and gas prices and supply and demand. And in 2007, expectations were that gasoline demand was going to grow dramatically by about 30% over the next 20, 30 years. In fact, it declined dramatically. And this made it more difficult to incorporate biofuels because when biofuels become a large percentage of the gasoline pool, the costs rise. They're actually quite low cost and actually save money up to around the 10%, above 10% compliance costs rise. You can see this here. This is actually very interesting to us because when we testified in 2016, we informed the committee that there was a certain price risk to the program, that if you try to drive these biofuels by mandates above 10% of the gasoline pool, the compliance costs escalate. And as Chairman Carper pointed out, the RIN credits are one way to understand what the program costs. And we estimated that using the CBO scenarios alone, that the increase in the cost of the program per gallon to consumers could be anywhere from 30 to 50 cents. Well, today, the RIN prices are driving up the cost of gasoline about 28.5 to 30 cents. You can see this in something called the crack spread. I'm not going to bore you with this, but in a way, the crack spread is what it costs to take crude oil and turn it into gasoline, diesel fuel, and other petroleum products. And you can see here that when we had a period, and I'm going to have Leanne's going to talk a lot about this, But before EPA changed the rule on how to treat the credits under the exemption, the RIN program actually was the small refiner exemptions were driving down RIN prices because it essentially increased the volume. But that program has ended, combined with the acceleration in prices as we come out of the COVID. We now have very high RIN prices in the U.S., and these are reflected in this chart. The other issue I'd like to point out is that we are now entering a period of very high oil prices. And in this period preceding this, prices were low, and a lot of the costs of the program were masked, right? Because as Ms. Coie pointed out, a big percentage of the cost of the program of gasoline and products is crude oil. And I'd like to show you here from California. The problem is, yes, crude oil might be contributing about $2, but an array of programs, low carbon fuel standard, RFS, federal taxes, all of these are contributing to the cost. And so we just have to keep this in mind, that one of the components of high gasoline prices are these programs. Now, I think I'll just flip to the end of my comments here, is that as we go forward, our future is very uncertain. And I really encourage Congress to, one, give some guidance to EPA, because unless we have a set of programs which are robust against uncertainty, we're likely to have a lot of dislocations. And this is the fundamental problem with the program, which is the mandate. Thank you so much.
Mr. Perulli-Arresti, thank you very, very much. And last but not least, we'll listen to Ms. Coie, and we thank you for your testimony. Please proceed.
Thank you, Chairman Carper, Ranking Member Capito, and members of the committee for the opportunity to talk about the Renewable Fuel Standard. I've spent the entirety of my 30-year career representing the petroleum refining industry, and particularly small refineries. I know their companies, I know their people, I know their communities, and now I also know the very real threat they face as a result of EPA's proposal to end small refinery hardship relief under the Renewable Fuel Standard. I'm referring, of course, to what Senator Capito described, EPA's December 7, 2021 proposal to issue a blanket denial of all pending small refinery hardship petitions. The EPA's deadline to issue their decisions was 90 days after the petitions were submitted. Instead, they now intend to deny them retroactively, causing small refineries to enter the market to buy RINs at their near record highs. Most important and most telling is the fact that EPA's proposed denial did not reference its legally required consultation with the Department of Energy and the Department of Energy's conclusion that if EPA acts as they propose to do, small refineries will be at risk of shutdown and bankruptcy. Notwithstanding that advice from the Department of Energy, or legally required consultation, EPA is moving ahead with its plans. Certainly, this was material information to parties asked to provide comments on the fate of small refineries. Senators, I'm sure you are acutely aware of the fact that gas prices are at their highest levels in 8 years, and that the inflation rate is increasing faster now than in the last 40, and we are at a crossroads. If EPA persists, ignoring its statutory duty and taking aim at America's small refineries, it will not only violate the law, it will exacerbate these already adverse economic conditions that our country faces. The harm to refineries and to the U.S. economy will be harms for harm's sake, because denying small refinery hardship relief cannot and will not affect 1 gallon of biodiesel. No biodiesel blending will be lost. At Congress's direction, the Department of Energy in a 2011 report determined that small refinery hardship would grow increasingly acute as the volume mandates increase, because as the volume mandates increase, RIN prices increase. When RIN prices increase, small refineries' costs increase. And that is because small refinery hardship is caused by their limited ability to blend, not their unwillingness to blend. EPA's 2021 proposed denial concludes that a small refinery with limited access to renewable fuel blend stocks, no downstream blending capability, no retail capability, no pipelines to access lucrative product markets will have the exact same cost to the penny to comply with a renewable fuel standard as the largest integrated oil company in the United States. Companies that have the ability to export their fuel and avoid the RFS mandate completely, companies with the ability to blend others' fuels, fuel produced by small refineries to generate excess RINs, and the ability to take those excess RINs and trade them, speculate in them in the wholly unregulated $30 billion RIN market. Large integrated refineries report in their public reports earning tens of millions of dollars in profits speculating in RINs. I listened to a hearing talking about the harm to the biofuels industry from granting small refinery hardship relief, which is a fiction. Small refineries, first of all, disproportionately produce diesel, not gasoline. They blend as much ethanol as they can, but gasoline is a small part of their production. The data demonstrate that there is zero correlation between small refinery hardship relief and the blend rate generally. So in the years when the hardship relief was granted more than in prior years, there was zero impact on the blend rate. This is a question that we have to have Ms. Score explain to us because there is clearly no correlation between the two. Forcing small refineries to buy RINs in record high RIN prices will result in their failure, it will result in their closure, and it will result in their bankruptcy, according to the Department of Energy, and EPA needs to step back.
Are you concluding? Have you concluded your remarks?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, Ms. Cope, thank you so much. Before we begin questions, I'm going to ask unanimous consent to place in the record materials on historical fuel and energy prices. Hearing no objection, so ordered. All right. Let's try some questions. Ms. Nguyen, the past administration's mismanagement of the renewable fuel standard, along with the ongoing fuel impacts of the pandemic, have created volatile swings in compliance costs for the renewable fuels program in recent years, making it hard for all stakeholders to plan and invest to meet the program's requirements. It's my understanding that Oregon has not experienced the same volatility in compliance cost with its clean fuels program. My question is this: how have the flexibilities built into Oregon's low carbon fuel standard, along with the additional cost containment and other measures within Oregon's program that differ from the federal program, how they help to mitigate compliance cost spikes? Ms. Nguyen.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Chair Carper. So I think a lot of what is built into the program is the ability for the agency to monitor the costs we do of our neighboring states in comparison to the state of Oregon. We do routinely track the fuel retail and wholesale prices of fuels that are delivered in California, in Washington, and in Idaho. And, you know, for the past years that we've been operating the program in Oregon, we have not seen a significant increase in comparison to those states. And, you know, and those are states that also don't necessarily, in the state of Idaho, don't have any kind of additional fuel standards. We do keep track of those prices, and we are legislatively required to, have cost containment mechanisms in the program to be able to monitor those fuel prices. And so, I mean, I think it's a combination of the monitoring and the cost containment mechanisms that have not caused these large volatilities in the fuel prices in Oregon.
All right, thanks. Just a quick follow-up. It's my understanding that Oregon tracks consumer fuel costs and surrounding state consumer fuel costs as part of its implementation of the low carbon fuel standard. Very briefly, are there surrounding states that do not have a low carbon fuel standard today that have higher fuel costs than Oregon?
Thank you for that question, Chair Carper. So as I previously stated, in the most recent analysis of the data that we've been looking at, it is we do compare our fuel prices, both retail and wholesale, to the states of Washington and California and Idaho. And it is noted that our fuel prices in Oregon have shown that we're lower than even the state of Idaho. And so the state of Idaho does not have any additional fuel regulations. They don't have a low carbon fuel standard in place there. And so we feel confident that the prices of the fuels in Oregon are not being disproportionately impacted by the fact that we do have a low carbon fuel standard.
All right, thanks for that. One question for Ms. Score, if I could, on E15 and advanced biofuels. Ms. Score, recent court decisions prevent the sale of fuels that have blends of ethanol to 15%, known as E15, this coming summer, unless Congress or the administration takes some further action. At the same time, EPA, over the course of several different administrations, has been slow to approve advanced biofuel applications for new pathways and fuels for the renewable fuel standard. Question is this: in your mind, would the approval of additional advanced biofuel applications and Congress acting to allow E15 to be sold year-round help mitigate some of the volatility in the renewable fuel program costs that we're seeing today?
Thank you, Chairman. It most certainly would. The easiest path to bring down the price of the RIN is to blend more biofuel. It's basic supply and demand. The more biofuels blended, in particular higher blends like E15, the more RINs created, and that's how you bring down the price of the RIN. So not only is that going to will it address the stated costs, but you're also going to be introducing a lower cost fuel into the fuel supply for consumers. And there are also technologies languishing at EPA that I've got producers currently producing cellulosic ethanol. They're not getting credit for it because the application has been sitting around for 5 years. So there's more innovation that we can do to bring low-cost, low-carbon fuels to the table, but we do need some certainty and some predictability, and for the regulations to keep up with the marketplace and the innovation.
All right, I have plenty more questions, but I'm going to yield it at this point to Senator Capito. Thank you for those responses, folks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Johnson, you in your remarks were pretty clear about the small refinery exemption. Obviously, I mentioned that in my opening remarks of my concern. And you're probably aware of the case that I brought forward of Ergon in West Virginia, who has 2 favorable court decisions from the Fourth Circuit. Shouldn't EPA take into consideration that our courts have actually taken into consideration making regulatory decisions, and that this was causing hardship to this small refinery? How would you respond to EPA's blanket denial of everything when the courts have actually come forward and said it's not a sound decision?
Yes. Senator Capito, you're exactly right. So for the 2016 to 2018 compliance years, the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals vacated and remanded EPA's decision to deny hardship relief to Ergon, West Virginia. Ergon runs about 23,000 barrels per day. It is truly one of the smallest refineries in the country. And the court summarily rejected EPA's decision because the EPA did not consider the facts of Ergon's specific case, its location, how it distributes its fuels, the fact that 70% of its then production was diesel, and it remanded to EPA. EPA then took another shot at Ergon and again denied Ergon's petition, even though it had been vacated and remanded by the court, and again determined that Ergon was ineligible. The second time, the Fourth Circuit vacated EPA's decision again, this time finding that EPA had been arbitrary and capricious in treating Ergon differently than any other small refinery. So now this is the third attempt to prevent Ergon, West Virginia, from receiving hardship relief. Essentially, what EPA is proposing to do is Ergon and every other small refinery in the United States will be denied hardship relief if EPA proceeds on this path, ironically, on the basis that every refinery in the United States, from the largest multinational oil company to the tiniest small refinery in Newell, West Virginia, has exactly the same cost of compliance. That it doesn't matter that a large integrated oil company can export. It doesn't matter that a large integrated oil company has excess RINs and makes millions in speculation. Everybody's cost is the same. And so I always go back to the DOE study prepared for Congress, which explains the hardship that small refineries will suffer as a result of their inability to blend, as a result of their inability to take massive amounts of capital and joint venture.
Thank you.
So yes, you're correct, Senator, that this is the third attempt to divest Ergon of relief.
And we specifically in the law made provisions for a small refinery exemption, correct?
Specifically made provisions for each petition to be decided on its merits. That's correct.
Thank you. Mr. Polaresi, your last chart, I was looking through your charts because we have them in our book, talks to me about where we see gas prices going and who really gets hurt the most. And this talks about the rising cost of transportation fuels harm low-income and many minority communities. We know if you have to pay an extra $10 to $15 to fill your car up, that hits that person that at the end of the month is looking for an extra $10 or $15 to help pay their electric bill or some other bill that's also rising at the same time. You talked about the cost of blending as about 28.5% or 28 to 30 cents per gallon, so there's a cost there. And then you also mentioned to me earlier before we got started that you think as we're moving forward, there's some guardrails that EPA needs to have as we're moving forward that we could provide for them. If you want to talk about that issue, I'd like to hear that, but I'd also like to hear your opinion on the overall cost of what we see now, high cost of gasoline, and how we can deal with this issue of who's hitting it the hardest and how we can move. There's proposals out here to get rid of the gas tax, but that's 18 cents. It's not even close to this.
So first, let's talk a little bit about the sort of government-mandated energy transition, because we are the largest oil and gas producer in the world. And we are very concerned that certain policies are now seeking to constrain the North American production platform before the alternatives are ready. We're going to have, we're going to produce a lot of EVs, we're going to produce a lot of alternative fuels and technologies. But if we proceed with, between 2010 and 2020, the United States alone, and plus the application of biofuels, provided over 80% of world increase in demand for liquid fuels. So that's the first thing we need to think about. We should treat this North American production platform as a strategic and economic asset. We should be very careful before we decide to disrupt it. So that's the biggest incentive, the biggest program we have to keep gas prices under control. The next thing is that we're fighting over a small volume here. Because in the absence of the mandate, we would still be blending anywhere from 8 to 10%. Ethanol is a valuable feedstock. It helps to meet octane requirements and other biofuels. But if we proceed with a mandate, we kind of prohibit innovation and alternatives to come forward because we have no idea what the fuels of the future really are going to look like. And then your final point, this is devastating for low-income communities, as you can see from that chart. And everyone who wants to proceed with these exotic fuels of the future should keep in mind that I don't believe the American people will react very positively if we go into a period of sustained high gasoline prices.
Thank you. Thank you.
All done? Okay. All right, thanks very much, Senator Capito. Senator Cardin was here earlier. He's now joining us, I think, by WebEx. Remotely, Senator Cardin, if you're there, please proceed with your questions. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you, Chairman Carper. I appreciate this very much. This hearing is long overdue. the history of the renewable fuel standards is something that needs to be understood, and we need to update this. So I very much appreciate your leadership on this issue. There's many competing priorities. We have energy security issues. We have the environment and our concerns for climate change. We have the cost issues that we've just talked about. And by the way, there's lots of governmental subsidies in regards to energy that affect the cost issues, not just here. And then the food stock. So I would like to get the view from our members of the panel as to what we can do if we want to focus on development and growth of domestic advanced biofuels derived from non-food-based food stocks. How should we be adjusting our policy in regards to renewable fuel standards? Don't be bashful.
I think that the way to do this is to allow a lot of alternative biofuels compete in the marketplace for the liquids market. And for those fuels which have a lot of promise and which we think there are substantial long-term public benefits, we should have a good research and development program, even some support for probably deployment. But in the end, we should allow a large opportunity for consumer choice and for competition to take place between manufacturers or processors of fuels to deploy these into the marketplace.
I will go ahead and I will follow on those themes of choice and competition, two themes that we wholeheartedly support. When it comes to choice, consumers do need choices. They need options at the pump. It is very unfortunate that come June 1st, one of the lowest carbon, low fuel, low cost options available to them is going to be eliminated because the few refineries sued and one in court. So we've got to reintroduce higher blends of biofuel, year-round access to E15. That's giving consumers one low-cost choice. When it comes to competition, as we all pursue lower carbon-intense energy, that's very important. And critical to that is making sure that the modeling, that the standards, that the incentives, the performance standards are technology neutral. In this country, let the best win, right? So let's make sure that we are looking at the full life cycle analysis of all of the technologies, of all of the available solutions. We're going to need everything to be able to achieve these ambitious climate goals. So make sure that the modeling reflects up-to-date science. It reflects innovation taking place within agriculture to bring down carbon intensity. And then I think you're going to have a competitive environment with choice for consumers.
I would just mention in that regard, Senator Carper and I both serve on the Senate Finance Committee, and we have looked at proposals to try to have neutral in regards to the tax issues and reward those that are lower in carbon emissions and that help our environment. So we agree with that. The problem is that today's structure does reward certain high carbon sources, and we really don't have a level playing field. I don't know if the other panelists want to respond on this or not.
Yes, thank you for the question. So this is Corianne Wynn. So I mean, I think this is what I would say is that this is what the core of a low carbon fuel standard does. And so, it really does reward the carbon intensity of that fuel. So as you mentioned, going from a crop-based fuel to a used, to a waste oil, for biodiesel, for example. I mean, so the fact that they do have lower emissions means that they do have higher incentives in a low carbon fuel standard. So those higher incentives actually bring down the cost of those fuels. So that is how it is scored in a low carbon fuel standard. And I think it's been working really well to incent the lowest of the lowest carbon fuels.
And of course, that's some of a debate we're having now on the price of carbon. And if we had a true price of carbon, I think we would have a fair competitive standard giving choice to the consumer. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Cardin. Before we turn to Senator Inhofe, I want to ask unanimous consent to submit for the record various materials demonstrating recent strong economic growth, including a statement from the Assistant Secretary for Economy Policy at the Department of Treasury from January 31st, 2022. According to the statement, real GDP growth grew 5.5% over the 4 quarters of 2021, the fastest annual pace in, get this, 37 years. This is in addition to the materials I submitted earlier, which show energy prices today are still lower than they were in 2007, and today's prices at the pump are driven by growth in fuel demand as the economy emerges from the pandemic. Without objection. Next is Senator Inhofe. Senator Inhofe will be followed by Senator Whitehouse. Senator Inhofe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And before you start my clock, I'm going to experiment with something that I haven't tried before. I have 2 questions, but the first question has 4 parts. So rather than put Ms. Johnson in a position of having to write down fast, I'm going to ask my staff to hand her the written copy of those 4 questions, which I will read now. First of all, Ms. Johnson, will denial of this...
The senator's time has expired.
I didn't do that to you.
All right, go ahead.
All right. Denial of the small refinery exemptions, of which we have 2 in Oklahoma, ultimately drive gas prices up? And does the data support an assertion that small refinery exemptions lower blending and biofuels? And please describe your understanding of the EPA's stakeholder engagement with refiners regarding the proposed rule. And is there data to support the claim that EPA's denial of hardship small refineries would contribute to closure of American refineries and lost jobs? Now, anything that's already been answered, you go ahead and run over that fast, all right?
Thank you, Senator Inhofe, and thank you for the list of questions. So with respect to your first question of whether denial of small refinery exemptions will drive compliance costs higher and gas prices higher, it is a certainty. If EPA publishes its proposed denial, the parties holding the RINs that small refineries need for compliance will be in a position to demand exorbitant prices because small refiners will be captive buyers on the eve of the compliance deadlines, multiple compliance deadlines on top of one another because EPA has been so delayed in its rulemaking. This is assuming that RINs are available at all. So my small refineries do not have the RINs that they need for compliance. They are physically unavailable. No more 2019s are available for compliance. No more 2020s are available for compliance because, as EPA described, parties' uncertainty about what the ultimate volumes will be are holding on to their excess RINs. So it is a recipe for crushing small refineries. It is a recipe for escalating RIN prices. They will get much worse if EPA moves forward with its proposal. Gas prices will increase with RIN prices for parties that can partially or fully pass through their costs, for example, large integrated oil companies and large exempt retailer chains, and small refineries will be forced to violate the law without hardship relief, shut down, curtail, or go bankrupt. Those are the Department of Energy's predictions. With respect to your second question, Senator, does the data support the assertion that small refinery exemptions lower blending of biofuels? I want to answer that in 2 parts. First of all, EPA's current proposal relates to compliance years 2019, 2020, and 2021. It is impossible to blend any more fuel in those years. Those years have already closed. So no biofuel blend rate will go down. And essentially, the other proof is that there's a lot of discussion about the 2016 to 2018 timeframe when the prior administration granted more hardship relief than it had historically. During the period of time when small refinery hardship increased, so did the blend rate. And the simple reason is small refineries cannot meaningfully impact the blend rate. The blending is done downstream. The only question is whether or not small refineries are going to make massive wealth transfer to the large integrated oil companies and large exempt blenders that hold the RINs needed for compliance. Your third question was to describe stakeholder engagement with refiners regarding the proposed rule. I can say this: small refiners were blindsided by EPA's proposal to retroactively deny all 2019 to 21 petitions. years after their statutory deadline to issue their decisions had passed. EPA checked a box. They met with us on August 25th of 2021. They shared no substance about their plans to issue retroactive mass adjudications and denials for small refineries. The proposal matches entirely, instead, the asks of the biofuel industry, which seems to have had meaningful engagement with EPA. EPA also seems to have engaged with the USDA. And by the way, Congress decided that the appropriate consultation was with the Department of Energy, not Ag. And the Department of Energy, as I've said, has determined that EPA's plan to deny hardship relief will result in the shutdown and closure of refineries. Your last question, Senator, was whether there is data to support the claim that EPA's denial would contribute to the closure of American refineries and lost jobs. And I won't repeat what I've said previously, but essentially, a number of small refineries do not have the RINs they need for compliance. And if they are denied relief, they will be captive buyers in a market with escalating RIN prices. And EPA has acknowledged that there was a shortcoming in the production of RINs for the 2019 compliance year, and that the RINs that are available in the market are not in the hands of small refineries. So small refineries will necessarily violate the Clean Air Act because they will not have the ability to get the RINs that they need for compliance, which will then force them to decide between spending money on RINs, if they have it, shutting down, and or going into bankruptcy. Senator, I hope I've answered each of your questions.
Excellent.
And you've done it in just the right amount of time. Gentleman's time is expired. Go ahead. Just briefly.
I do have one last
Very briefly.
thing for Mr. Polaresi, and that is there anything, I know you talked about this and you answered the question and addressed this also, but are there anything about, in terms of the risks associated with an entirely electric fleet that you didn't adequately cover?
Yes, right.
Just very briefly, if you would, please. Very briefly in response.
The biggest problem is we are energy independent now. In order to move to an electric fleet, we have to move to a series of critical materials and minerals, on which we will be highly dependent. Some of them sourced from countries that are not necessarily friendly to the United States. And if I may just correct one, this one question that I thought is very interesting. It's very important to understand that Oregon has the 5th highest gasoline prices in the country. So it may be lower than some other adjoining states, but gasoline prices are quite high in Oregon.
All right, thank you. All right, Senator Whitehouse, you're up. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Chairman, and thanks everyone for being here. I have long supported the biofuels and ethanol standard, but it's kind of been an act of faith that someday the market would come around and that corn ethanol in particular was kind of a pathway effort that would let cellulosic ethanol and other forms come forward. So I'm interested, Ms. Wind, in your testimony about the carbon intensity of the ethanol and biodiesel that Oregon uses, that it has decreased. I'm wondering how confident you are in the measure of carbon intensity of your corn ethanol fuel stock.
Yes, thank you for that question, Senator. So we do use the Argonne GREET model to calculate carbon intensities in the state of Oregon, which is the accepted national model to do so. With respect to with the ethanols that we are receiving in Oregon, the import of that fuel, I mean, it is producer specific, and so we can keep very close track of the different ethanols that we are getting, even the corn ethanols. And what we're seeing is an incremental decreases in the carbon intensity. So for ethanol over the past 6 years, it has continued to incrementally go down, probably in about 10%. the carbon intensity of the biodiesels have had more of a significant decrease. But it is steady, and it shows that there are value in a low carbon fuel standard to continue to draw down those carbon intensities. These facilities are getting more efficient and better at their energy inputs, and that is reflected in the lower of the carbon intensity scores.
You mentioned cellulosic ethanol, I believe. What is the market share within the ethanol market of cellulosic ethanol? Or in your portfolio, if you know that better than the national market?
Yes, thank you for that, Senator. So as far as cellulosic ethanol, we don't have any cellulosic ethanol coming into the state of Oregon. So the ethanol that is coming into Oregon, it's not cellulosic, but it is decreasing in carbon intensity.
How much of it is corn?
It's 100% corn.
Okay, there we go. One of the things that I think we need to do in order to find a pathway to climate safety is to put a price on carbon. That seems to be fairly commonly held view among economists and banks and so forth, and among people who are looking hard at the climate problem for emissions reduction solutions. And at present, the absence of one is a really massive subsidy for the fossil fuel industry. The International Monetary Fund calculates it north of $600 billion per year just in the United States. $600 billion per year is an enormous number, and it provides a very strong motive for a massive political elections lobbying operation by the protected and subsidized fuel to defend and protect its subsidy politically. So we're in a kind of a difficult position here in Congress. I'm wondering, back to you again, Ms. Wind, if there were a price on carbon, how would that affect the ethanol portion of your fuel market?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So, in effect, the way that the low carbon fuel standard works is that the monetization, kind of the value of the fuel, is in the credit prices that are being traded in the program. So this is a market that we do not control. It is the market contributes to the credit prices of the credits that are traded within the program. And so currently speaking, the credits in the state of Oregon are trading at about $125 per ton. It has been higher, it has been lower. We publish that on a monthly basis to show transparency to the market. And so, there is certainty in what that credit price is that is associated with the carbon. And so that's how we do it in a low carbon fuel standard.
My time's up, Chairman. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Senator Kramer.
Thank you, Senator Capito. Thanks to all of you for being here. This is a topic that has perplexed me since the day I got to Congress. It's not the topic that perplexes me as much as the debate. It never changes. A lot has changed since 2005 and 2007 when the RFS was created during a time of scarcity of natural resources. Of course, we now have an abundance of natural resources. In the meantime, we have some other policy decisions. I mean, we have an administration right now pushing for up to $12,500 per electric vehicle subsidy to change the demand for electric vehicles. I'm going to just state some facts, and then I'm going to ask just for some feedback. So we have this debate over this constantly moving target, right? And several of us have had this discussion, but and what I would say it would be as a result of lazy legislating, which I'm convinced is a historical phenomenon in this country. Administrations have been given an awful lot of leeway to determine things like RVOs, even when they're stated in the law. Obviously the hardship, the small refinery hardship waivers, another tool. And then we get upset because, for 4 years it's one way, and then for 4 years it's another way, and then for 4 years it's another way. And I know a couple of you and I have had this discussion, but when it seems to me that at the end of this year, we kind of like to, well, for the last decade, several people I've discussed this with have liked to deny that at the end of 2022, there's a new rule in place that the RVOs are no longer in law. I mean, they're in law, but they're not required, that the authority to set the RVOs, in other words, the EPA and the administration has even more unilateral authority after this year. And I guess I'd like to just have a little discussion from the panel. What's your understanding? We'll start with you, Ms. Johnson. What's your understanding of the act when the RVOs switch over, or the EPA gets carte blanche, in my view, authority in 2023 to set the RVOs? I mean, where are we going to go if nothing happens and they have that authority?
Thank you, Senator. I think that's an excellent question and something that keeps me awake at night, because I see this freight train heading towards the highest possible RVOs to try to break through the blend wall and to promote E15. The problem is that EPA had discretion in how to set up the program, and it set up the program in such a way that it distorted competition. Growth Energy has stood shoulder to shoulder with the American Petroleum Institute, which represents the large integrated refineries, preventing closing the blender loophole. So essentially, growth's theory is that just keep pushing, just keep pushing, just keep pushing. At some point, E15 will happen. E15 won't happen before every small refinery is shut down, because right now we're counting on volunteer blending, what we call the blender loophole. Small refineries do not have the ability to blend. Large integrated refineries have the ability to blend more than they produce. Until this market distortion is fixed, it's a recipe for destroying those refineries that cannot blend. So if we want to keep pushing E15, if we have in fact determined that E15 results in reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, which is something that I don't think we at all agree with, we need to fix the structure of a program. I was interested in the discussion of cost caps. So very many times, limitations on the ability to speculate in the RIN market, limitations on the cost of a RIN, obligating blenders, all of these proposals to fix the things that are preventing renewable fuel blending have not occurred. So if we just go straight ahead, we're going to just collateral damage our industry.
Ms. Coie, first of all, I want you to be able to respond to that, but couldn't a future administration, instead of pushing E15, just eliminate, could they go to zero? Would that be possible, or 1 gallon or something like that in the law?
Senator, thank you for the question. So yes, after 2023, there are no congressionally set blending requirements. So EPA does have greater flexibility in terms of setting the blending obligations. A few important things: they still have some criteria that they need to consider: jobs creation, energy independence, environmental impact. And I think, one of the things that we have all suffered from in every sector is the lack of certainty and stability. And so if there is an obligation, it needs to mean something. If there's a deadline, it needs to mean something. One of the things we look forward to in the set is EPA's opportunity to set blending requirements for multiple years in advance, similar to what Ms. Wind was talking about in Oregon. And I think that would help address some of the volatility concerns.
Thank you. I wish we had more time, maybe in another round, Mr. Chairman. But the biggest point that I want to make is that 2022 is here now. For 10 years, people looked at me like, "Don't worry, that's in the future." What's not in the future anymore? So we have to come up with something. And I'd rather come up with it with everyone in the room, if you know what I'm saying.
Well, as long as it includes us.
As long as you're in the room with me, I'm good. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, sir. All right. Thanks, Senator Kramer. Senator Duckworth, I think you're out there on WebEx. If you are, please proceed. Senator Duckworth. No? Senator Lummis is here in person, live and in person, and we'll come back to Senator Duckworth where he can rejoin us. Senator Lummis, you're recognized. And then I have Senator Stabenow after you by WebEx. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to begin by asking consent to enter 3 documents into the hearing record. One is an academic study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science called Environmental Outcomes of the U.S. Renewable Fuel Standard. The second is a study by the University of Georgia called Analyzing the Downstream Impacts of U.S. Biofuel Policies. And the third is an article entitled U.S. Bread and Donut Makers Urge Biden to Roll Back Biofuel Requirements. I want to share a personal...
Is there objection? Hearing none. So
Thank you.
welcome.
Thank you very much. We've already heard testimony that the RFS mandate is adding about 28 to 30 cents a gallon to the wholesale cost of gas on average, and of course at a time when fuel prices are extremely high and inflation is extremely high. It works a hardship on consumers, and I believe we should look at every avenue to provide relief to consumers. When I'm in Cheyenne, on the ranch I grew up in the house I grew up in, I live right next door to a small refinery that lost its small refiner exemption. Furthermore, they were unable to, when refining for hydrocarbons, they were absolutely unable to purchase non-hydrocarbons to blend to meet the renewable fuel standards. So they converted the oil refinery to a refinery that now refines soybean oil. That refinery in our little town, in the state with the smallest population in the nation, went from 260 livable wage jobs to 60 livable wage jobs. We lost 200 employees in Cheyenne, which is a huge number in our little community. So this has had an enormous impact on our community. So, and this happened during the previous administration's tenure. So I didn't see them slow walking the loss of the small refiners exemption. I saw them putting the hammer down and costing small communities like mine hundreds of jobs. So Ms. Johnson and Mr. Polaracci, when Congress created the biofuel mandate, we predicted that the program would disadvantage small refineries, and of course it has. It increasingly precludes refineries from selling the products they produce and requires them to buy products they don't produce, if they can get them. So this squeezes the smallest firms first and most severely. Higher cost producers are harmed the most and first in time. So is this an effort to just make sure that, much as we did with banks, you're too big to fail or too small to succeed? And in the case of small refiners, are they too small now to succeed?
Senator, I might just, so if you think about the American sort of refining complex, right? It's, we traditionally had a lot of oil production produced and processed on the Gulf Coast, and then the products moved up to up the continent. But of course, with the emergence of production in North Dakota and the energy independence in the U.S., our smaller refiners and regional became much more important. And I think they provide a vital role. And as I've said, I think the solution remains, in order for all these different facilities with their different cost structures and their different markets to adapt, they need an open market. And the fundamental problem they all face is these mandated requirements to blend to certain targets, which do not necessarily yield any benefits even to the farmers. The program is, as I said, we are fighting over very small volumes. And if we were to open it up and have some broad support for moving biofuels forward, we would all be a lot better off. And these kinds of dislocations would tend to disappear.
Ms. Johnson, same question.
Senator, I really appreciate your question. It reminds me of something one of my small refineries said to me. We dance between the toes of giants. And what that means is the smallest refinery in Cheyenne, Wyoming, the smallest refinery in Newell, West Virginia, the smallest refinery in whatever rural community from Pennsylvania to California, dance between the toes of giant integrated multinational oil companies until the renewable fuel standard came along and said, you know what, we're going to tilt competition in favor of the large integrated oil companies, but don't worry, we've got your back. Congress said specifically, we recognize that the volume mandates and the inability of small refineries to have access to capital to become large integrated oil companies that don't have access to pipelines, that don't have access to, that disproportionately produce diesel fuel, don't have access to blend stocks. Don't worry, we've got your back, you'll be okay, we can provide an exemption. Small refineries blend every drop of blend stock they possibly can, but they don't always have access and they don't always have the ability. So what happens is that they are captive buyers in a wildly inflated RIN market, and that is how they are harmed. And I just want to be clear, when we talk about 2019, 2020, and 2021, where EPA has proposed to deny hardship relief, not one more drop of renewable fuel can be blended. So what we're talking about is EPA compelling small refineries to make massive wealth transfers to large integrated oil companies because they don't have access to feedstock, because they cannot blend. It's un-American.
Well, and that is, I think, that should be the focus of some of the work that we do to have a better renewable fuel standard program, because we are just assuring that only the big integrated companies will succeed and all of the small businesses will fail. They're, once again, moving people out of small rural communities and into the bigger areas that have the bigger refineries. It's happening in so many industries that it's having a profound effect on America's jobs and demographics. There has to be a way to encourage renewable fuels at the same time that you don't make it all about the small fail and the big survive and thrive. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much for being here and for those questions. Senator Duckworth, have you joined us yet on WebEx?
Yes, I have, Mr. Chairman.
All right, Senator Duckworth, you're recognized, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Score, as some of the comments made at today's hearing demonstrate, there's seemingly no end to the list that opponents of the RFS program will seek to pin on American biofuels. Critics now appear to be blaming biofuels for rising retail gas prices, notwithstanding the reality that what consumers pay at the pump is largely determined by A, oil prices, and B, basic supply and demand. Ms. Score, could you address the claim that RIN prices and biofuel production are somehow responsible for increasing retail gas prices?
Thank you, Senator. And yes, those are false claims. So the price of the RIN has no bearing on the price of fuel at the pump. Those are entirely separate markets. Well, the dominant factor driving the price of fuel for consumers at the pump is the price of crude oil, in addition to supply and demand. That's something that is affirmed by our government agencies and other modeling. And I think what's really important to understand is the role of biofuel in bringing down the price of fuel for the consumers. And the evidence today is the price of E15. So consumers in 31 states today, they can go up to the pump and they could put in standard 87, that's a 10% blend, Some of them could choose an 88 octane. That is a 15% blend. When they have a little bit more ethanol, that actually brings the price down. They're saving up to 10 cents per gallon. And there are also stations where you can buy 0% ethanol. There you're paying a premium up to 50 cents not to have ethanol. So most assuredly, biofuels like ethanol help bring down the cost of gas prices.
Thank you. And Ms. Score, based on how Big Oil describes the burdens of purchasing RINs, it is impressive that oil refiners survived the bipartisan enactment of the RFS more than 15 years ago. My understanding is that EPA, under the last 3 administrations, the American Petroleum Institute and numerous individual oil companies are all on public record confirming that oil refiners, large and small, recover RIN costs downstream and are therefore not irreparably harmed by the amount of money they pay to acquire RINs. Could you help us understand how, despite the arguments of big oil over many years, oil refiners have managed to purchase RINs and stay in business?
Thank you for the question. Yes, so the RIN affords refiners flexibility in terms of how they demonstrate compliance with the RFS. They can blend biofuel like ethanol and they can hand in a RIN, or they can purchase a RIN. So they've got the flexibility to be able to do this. And the RFS has been in place since 2007. So we've had more than a decade for the businesses to understand their annual obligations and make business decisions accordingly. And again, important to understand kind of the RIN marketplace and the volatility that you see when you have refiners who are choosing not to blend and wait till the 11th hour and then seek some type of exemption or waiver or extension from the agency. I think that's really where you're seeing the volatility come into play. But the bottom line is, when it comes to consumer price at the pump, the more biofuel, the more they're going to save.
Thank you, Ms. Score. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record EPA analyses from 2015, 2017, and 2021 that confirm what Ms. Score just explained, along with 2 documents that counter the recent study that has garnered attention this week, one from the Renewable Fuels Association and another from the National Corn Growers Association, indicating, among other things, that the USDA found that ethanol's carbon intensity was 39% lower than gasoline, and that according to the EPA, the RFS has not expanded cropland. It has in fact decreased them by increased efficiency on existing cropland, not by expanding acreage. And according to the USDA, the amount of fertilizer required to produce a bushel of corn has fallen dramatically in recent decades since the creation of the RFS.
Is that your unanimous consent request?
Yes.
Is there objection? Hearing none, so ordered. Thank you.
Thank you. I also asked unanimous consent to include in the record for this hearing reports from Environmental Health and Engineering. It's a report addressing biofuels and greenhouse gas reduction. The Life Cycle Associates 2020 report documenting the 1 billion metric tons of GHG reductions attributed to biofuel use since 2007. Third, a study published by USDA scientists in 2021 titled The Greenhouse Gas Benefits of Corn Ethanol, Assessing Recent Evidence, which found climate-smart agriculture practices reduce emissions. And finally, fourth, a study published by Argonne National Laboratory that found corn ethanol is reducing the carbon footprint and diminishing GHG emissions.
Is there objection? Hearing none, so ordered.
Thank you. These studies confirm what we already know. American-grown blended biofuels have been reducing GHG emissions for years, and the RFS has played an integral part in these efforts. I'm out of time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All righty. Thank you. Thanks so much. Senator Rich, you've been patient, but Senator Stabenow has been patient as well on the WebEx. If you don't mind, I'm going to let her go first, and then you're immediately right after her. Thank you for your patience. All right, Senator Stabenow, you're there?
I am, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to Senator Ernst. I appreciate so much working with her on these issues, and I appreciate very much you're doing this hearing. I want to take just a step back, way back for a moment, and kind of frame this as, I think this has been framed as big refiners, small refiners, and so on. This is really about whether we're going to continue the dirtiest kind of fuel or have cleaner fuels. And if you go back 100 years, actually Henry Ford and Thomas Edison first tried to do a vehicle with a battery, but could not get public support, government support to help them create the innovation. And 2 years later, the biggest permanent tax credits for oil and gas were embedded in our federal tax code, and they've been there 100 years. And so when folks thought we at that time picked a winner and they won. And so now we're trying to just balance that out with giving opportunities to biofuels, electric vehicles, wind, solar, and so on, all of which start and stop. It is not a consistent policy. It's not embedded in the tax code. And so I want to ask Ms. Score, when we look at, from a business standpoint, the importance of policy and regulatory certainty when you're making investment decisions, innovation decisions, and so on, how important is that?
Thank you for the question, Senator. That's incredibly important. I think there's a very good example in terms of my industry is producing right now cellulosic biofuel. All right, that is up to 100% and beyond in terms of the GHG reductions, but we're not getting credit for it because the technologies have been pending EPA review for over 5 years. So we as a nation, we are leaving carbon reductions on the table, and then the impact is you have innovators sitting on the sidelines because they see a lack of certainty, a lack of a marketplace moving forward, and therefore they're going to sit this one out. So it really does stifle the innovation, the investment that we need to continue to bring down the carbon intensity of corn ethanol, which we are doing a great job of doing that, and also to be able to get our industry to net zero and participating in the hard-to-electrify space. And that's a place where we're going to be able to perform as a really important feedstock.
Thank you. And just one more time for the record, do biofuels, are biofuels responsible for high gas prices?
No, quite the opposite. The more biofuels that we introduce into the fuel supply, the more we bring down the price at the pump for every driver.
Thank you. And it's also jobs, right, in rural America, certainly in rural Michigan. So one other question I have to ask as somebody who not only is a supporter of biofuels and rural jobs, but also electric vehicles being made in my great state. Both are important to reducing carbon emissions in the transportation sector. And I think it's important, just for the record, to say that's why the United Auto Workers, who make great automobiles and the new electric vehicles, strongly support the renewable fuel standard as well. In fact, the UAW is the largest private union in Iowa, with members employed by companies making farm equipment, and they consistently talk about the fact that that they are supportive. So, Ms. Gore, does Growth Energy agree that both electric vehicles and biofuels are critical to reducing carbon emissions and petroleum use?
Yes, let me add that we appreciated UAW submitted very strong remarks to EPA in support of a robust RFS. We have very ambitious climate goals, and there is no one-size-fits-all solution. We're going to need every tool in the toolbox, which means biofuels alongside electrification. The benefits of biofuels, those are going to be for the immediate, the mid, and the long term. In the immediate term, we have about 270 million cars on the road today. So biofuels allow us to have a solution for those cars, to bring down the emissions, to clean up the emissions, and do it so affordably and in an available way for all consumers. In the mid to long term, if we are a strong industry today, that allows us to have the innovation that we are continuing to do to further drive down the carbon intensity of our low carbon fuel, but also participate into the hard to electrify space. For that, we need accurate carbon modeling, and we need to make sure that the incentives provide a fair, level playing field for all of the parties who want to be able to compete and participate.
Thank you. I agree. And Mr. Chairman, I will yield back and yield to my friend from Iowa, Senator Ernst.
Senator Ernst, patience is rewarded. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. I appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I ask for unanimous consent to submit to the record comments from the Renewable Fuels Association and the Clean Fuels Alliance.
I think we're going to send a record here for unanimous consent request, but without objection.
Outstanding. Thank you so much. And just to address some of the issues that have been brought forward by our witnesses and members of the committee as well. Just looking back at the average closing price of crude oil in 2020, it was $39.68 a barrel. And the average closing price in 2022 so far is $85.72 a barrel. And today it was $95.46 per barrel of crude oil. Is that due to the RFS, to our witnesses? Emily?
I'll go ahead and take that one. Absolutely not. The primary factor in terms of the cost of fuel at the pump is going to be the cost of crude oil, and it has nothing to do with the RFS.
Thank you, Ms. Score. I think a point that's I think our members are trying to make today is the cost of fuel is because of the RFS. It's not. It's about the price of oil. So I reject that. I hope that our folks out there listening are paying attention to that. The price of our fuel is the price of the oil. So we've had the RFS around for a number of years. And the reason we have is because Congress asked for the RFS to be established so that we could reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. The folks across the Midwest, our farmers, our producers, responded to the call to Congress, and they developed systems that produce clean, reliable energy sources. And I also reject the premise that oil refineries and their rural communities are more important than my rural communities. As we're looking to 2023 and beyond, America's farmers and the biofuel sector are best positioned to work with this administration and others to put the renewable fuel standard back on track and be part of the solution to secure a clean energy future. As much as the Biden administration dreams of an all-electric world, the reality is liquid fuels are here to stay. With 98% of cars and trucks today and nearly 80% of new vehicle sales projected in 2050 running on gasoline or flex fuel, biofuel is the key pathway to decarbonizing the transportation sector, and the RFS is the policy engine that makes this possible. Congress passed the Energy Policy Act of 2005 and the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007, which mandated the RFS in part to help reduce America's dependence on foreign nations. Folks, I firmly believe energy security is national security. And while President Biden claims to support America's clean energy economy, he is turning his back on the RFS in favor of electric vehicles, which will only make us more dependent on China. And science is on our side here, too. Biofuel has enabled the U.S. to cut emissions from the transportation sector for over a decade. Between 2008 and 2020, the RFS saved nearly 1 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent greenhouse gas emissions, and it's only getting cleaner. The latest research shows corn ethanol is 46% less carbon intensive than petroleum-based gasoline, and biodiesel is 74% less carbon intensive than petroleum-based diesel. Biofuel can further reduce greenhouse gas emissions with carbon capture and sequestration technologies and on-farm conservation practices, which many of our Iowa farmers are already doing. So let's follow the science and use biofuel as part of a clean energy policy. But it's not only the clean energy source. Biofuel is also great for our economy and our pocketbooks. Iowa corn and soybean farmers had record high crop yields in 2021. The biofuel industry accounts for over $5 billion of GDP, generates $2.6 billion of income for households, and supports nearly 46,000 jobs in Iowa alone, in my rural areas. Ethanol is also the cheapest form of fuel for consumers right now by about 50 cents. 50 cents. And certainly with record high inflation, it only makes sense to make this fuel source more readily available. And that's why I continue to urge the administration, allow summertime sales of E15 as soon as possible. It will not only support our consumers, it'll also support the nearly 300 retail stations in Iowa who want to provide a cleaner choice at the pump. Folks, the RFS is the law, and refiners have had over 15 years to come into compliance. Blend renewable fuels or buy RINs. It's your choice. Any claim that RIN prices are increasing gas prices, it is a bunch of hogwash. Refiners claim they need exemptions because RINs cost them money. But the last 3 administrations have said RIN prices do not cause harm to refiners. Small refinery exemptions go against congressional intent, and the Supreme Court reinforced this. A strong RFS supports rural America and increases consumer access to affordable, homegrown, clean-burning biofuel today, tomorrow, and we also hope for many years to come. And thank you. I will yield back.
Thanks, Senator. So again, thanks for your attendance. Thanks for your patience and your questions and comments. Several members and witnesses have asserted that the increase of gasoline at the pump is attributable to crude oil prices. So I asked my staff, I said, well, let's actually look at the numbers. And if you go back to February 2021, price of oil at the pump was, it looks like $62.28, $62.28. The price today is $94, roughly $94 per barrel. That's an increase of about 51%. So those are interesting numbers. All righty. I've got a couple of questions, and Senator Capito, you may have some wrap-up questions as well. And before we do that, Senator Wicker, Roger's going to try to get here. Maybe he's joining us remotely. Senator Wicker, are you out there anywhere? No, he's not going to be able to come. Okay, thanks. All right. A couple of questions. So again, the first one that I'd like to ask is, or the next one I'd like to ask Ms. Wynn, with respect to eligible fuels. Unlike the renewable fuel standard, which requires eligible liquid and gaseous fuels and electricity to be derived from renewable biomass sources, low carbon fuel standard programs like Oregon's are generally intended to be both fuel neutral and technology neutral. With this in mind, the Oregon Clean Fuel Program has a broader definition of transportation fuels than the federal renewable fuel standard. My question, Ms. Wind, is how has this broader definition of transportation fuels benefited the Oregon program, and how has this encouraged investment in producing cleaner fuels in your state?
Yes, thank you for that question, Senator Carper. So that is true. I mean, in the state of Oregon with the low carbon fuel standard, we do basically value any of the transportation fuels that are lower carbon than gas and diesel. So in addition to the biofuels and electricity, we also do have renewable natural gas. We have propane and renewable propane, and we're going to be investing more in hydrogen as well. And so, what we'd like to see is that even with natural gas and with propane, that we switch from the fossil versions to the renewable versions. But even the switch from, say, fossil gasoline or fossil diesel, there are benefits from the propane and the natural gas. So, if those are the fuels that, because of the lower cost of those fuels, are what is leading to more infrastructure, more vehicles, an alternative fuel space, and then switching to the renewable versions lowers the carbon intensities even more. Those are the kinds of things that we also see in the state of Oregon, and will likely continue to see as we move into the future for the Oregon Clean Fuels Program.
Okay, thanks, Ms. Wynn. I have a follow-up question also to Ms. Score. Ms. Score, with restrictions on what qualifies as an advanced fuel under renewable fuel standards, could a technology-neutral program like Oregon's Clean Fuels Program allow more opportunity for your member companies to participate than the current structure of the renewable fuel standard?
Thank you for the question. Yes, we are a low-carbon fuel, so we do very much appreciate the concept of a low-carbon fuel standard. Importantly, as you stated, Senator, making sure that this is technology neutral. And so this is where the carbon modeling comes into play. And we've got to make sure that you are evaluating the full life cycle analysis of biofuels like ethanol, that you are considering all of the low-carbon farming practices that continue to bring down the carbon intensity of our fuel. So if you have a program that is truly technology neutral, that reflects the current state-of-the-art science and the innovation taking place throughout industry, that allows for use of higher biofuel blends like in E15, that's a place where we can play, and I think we'll be able to really help in terms of achieve some of our collective low-carbon goals. I will add that that's very complementary to the RFS. So the two programs work well in tandem. I think Ms. Wind talked earlier about that value stack to continue making sure the lowest of the low would go into a market like in Oregon.
I've got two more quick questions. Well, I got two more quick ones, and then I'm going to yield to Senator Capito. We have a vote underway as well. This is a question for the entire panel, and I'd ask, what would I say? I appreciate the perspectives. I think we all do, the perspectives that our panel has shared with us today. I want to compliment our staffs for pulling you all together, and thank you for joining us in person and remotely. But I hope that this dialogue can help inform thoughtful action to support the future of this important program. And with that said, I also recognize the challenges in forging a path forward for the renewable fuel standard that satisfies everyone and the potential need for compromise and collaboration. In closing, I'm just going to ask each of you to take just half a minute, if you will, to tell us what you believe, where you believe there might be common ground for all of us on this panel as we deliberate this issue going forward, and we will. Ms. Coie, would you like to go first?
Certainly, thank you. I heard a lot of consensus about the importance of competition, about the importance of marketplace certainty, and the importance of consumer choice as we make sure that we drive toward low carbon fuel options for consumers that are affordable and available. And this is a place where biofuels really have a role to play. What we need is a renewable fuel standard that is enforced. So there is some certainty, and those making business decisions throughout the fuel supply chain, including agriculture, biofuel, and on the refining side. So we understand what the obligations are, and we bring down that volatility. And so we look forward to seeing the EPA fix and finalize the blending obligations for 20 and 21 and 22 as expeditiously as possible. That kind of certainty is going to be something that's going to be good for all parties.
Thank you. Senator Ernst, do you have one more question?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just very briefly, because I think I've gotten most of the answers for my questions, but I would like Ms. Coie, Emily, would you respond about give a statement or thoughts on the anti-ethanol study that was done earlier this week?
I appreciate the comment. Thank you. Yes, I'm familiar with that. And it's really very concerning when you look at the manipulation of the science and data, the unorthodox methodology that leads to really fictitious and erroneous conclusions. In short, you've got a piece of work that's untethered from reality. You look at the totality of science and the consensus of EPA, Department of Energy's Argonne National Labs, California Air Resources Board, Oregon's Department of Environmental Quality, and of course, many academicians and scientists. Ethanol is lower carbon than gasoline, and that advantage continues to increase.
Thank you, Ms. Coie. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Sure. Senator Capito has one last question, then I'll ask the remainder of my time to go to three of our witnesses, and then we'll wrap it up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I do have to. I have to run really quick after I just make a comment or two. I think it's been a very interesting hearing. I think there is consensus that there's a lack of certainty, maybe certainty in different areas that you might share different areas that don't have certainty, but you're looking to us to provide some of the certainty so that EPA can move forward. In my view, nothing screams lack of certainty than having an exemption that is then revoked 2 years later. I mean, that to me is just unconscionable, no matter what it's happening to. If it was a corn producer, if it was a refiner, if it's a coal miner, anything, an EV car maker, if you have the okay and it says that you're going to have the permit to move forward, how can you possibly conduct business if somebody's going to come back 2 years later and revoke it? So, I mean, I think that to me is lack of certainty. And you know, I do have the study here that shows from the University of Wisconsin that U.S. corn-based ethanol is worse for the climate. I'm not going to argue that. I don't know. I think that we need to get what is a life cycle? When does it start? How long does it go? What kind of emissions are included in producing ethanol from corn or growing corn or getting crude out of the ground. I mean, I think we need to have some consistency here and certainty here on that we're using the same measurement data, because I think it confuses the American public, quite frankly, and many of us here who are making those decisions. I just want to thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't really have a question. I just thank the witnesses for being informed, and I thought our members asked some really good questions.
Yeah, this has been valuable. This committee, as you know, is pretty good at finding the middle and complex, difficult issues, unanimously in some cases. And this is a hard one. And we look forward to working with your team and others that are on this committee and trying to find a path forward going forward. I'd like to say, if it isn't perfect, make it better. The situation is not a perfect situation. We got to do better than this. Thank you. I'm going to go back to our panel again. I'd ask a question I call a common ground question. And I'd ask each of you to take a minute to let us know where you believe there's common ground among all of you. I think only Ms. Score had the opportunity to respond. So let me just ask our other witnesses if they would respond as well. And Ms. Nguyen, why don't you go first?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Senator Harper. I think I would echo.
Common ground.
I think I would. Yes, common ground. So I think I would echo what Ms. Score has and Ranking Member Capito have mentioned, certainty. It is something that we hear quite a bit from the stakeholders that participate in the Oregon Clean Fuels Program and in the market. Certainty as far as regulatory certainty, as far as the standards being established for our program. That is why we are undertaking our current rulemaking now to expand those standards out to 2035 to provide that certainty. And I think along with certainty, I mean, transparency in what we do, in the way that we do our life cycle accounting and the modeling and the information that is used to establish those carbon intensities, as well as the market aspects of our program, the credit pricing and the transactions for that. I mean, it is something that is the pillars of how we implement the program in Oregon, and I think has served us really well.
Thank you, ma'am. Mr. Pugliaresi.
Yes, thank you.
Did I get it right?
Yes.
Pugliaresi?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah.
I was thinking one of the problems is maybe we should try to do a better job of getting a common set of facts so we can.
Sometimes that helps.
Sometimes it helps. And I think that one of the things I'd like to ask the community to do is let's have the Energy Information Agency publish data for us on what the FOB export price of gasoline is and what the wholesale domestic price of gasoline is. Let's have them break down the components, because there's a lot of discussion of crude oil is causing prices to go up. Of course it is, but there are other components in the manufacturing of transportation fuels. And I think if we could get them to do a little more work on this, we might get some consensus or a sense of where are the hot spots, so to speak, beyond crude oil that are driving up gasoline prices.
Good. Thank you for that suggestion. Ms. Coe? Same question.
I think a common ground is that small refineries do not oppose biofuels. So biofuels that are lower emitting are not a problem. Where we depart is on the ability of everybody to share and the ability to blend or pay reasonably high RIN prices. But I would say that we have commonality in wanting lower emitting biofuels. I think there's where we depart on that point also is on whether or not ethanol is in fact a lower emitting fuel, because as we've been talking about, the recent studies suggest that ethanol could be 24% higher emitting of greenhouse gas emissions than petroleum-based fuels. So to Mr. Pugliaresi's point, information is key. Senator Ernst explained that blending is a choice. It is not a choice when you don't have access to biofuels. So I think the EIA could help us enormously by, instead of resisting Freedom of Information Act requests related to how much is each refinery paying to buy RINs? What is each refinery's actual cost of compliance? We understand that sufficient RINs are available for compliance, but not in the hands necessarily of the people who need them for compliance. Whose hands are they in? So more forthcoming data would certainly help to dispel maybe some of the disagreements. So I think that would be important. there are substantial barriers to blending, which I agree with Ms. Score. There are. I think we disagree as to what those barriers are, but there are substantial barriers. We have to have a change to the renewable fuel standard if we want it to be sensible, if we want it to not distort competition, and if we want to bring down the price of gasoline and diesel.
Thank you. I have a real quick question for Ms. Score. I'm going to ask you to just be very brief in your response because we have a vote underway, and I don't want to miss that vote. But Ms. Score, it's my understanding that the previous administration significantly increased the number of small refinery waivers it issued compared to the Obama administration, including issuing waivers for refineries owned by integrated companies like, I think, like ExxonMobil. Is that your understanding?
That's correct, Mr. Chairman. In the previous administration, EPA increased the number of small refinery exemptions by a factor of 6. That was a 6-fold increase. Over 80 small refinery exemptions resulted in 4 billion gallons of demand destruction, and without any information or transparency in the theme of information as to how it is that they determined that those particular refiners met the very narrow threshold that is, you've got to demonstrate disproportionate economic harm as a result of RFS compliance. So we are pleased to see that this EPA is taking a different approach and really looking to follow the law and the narrow scope of that relief avenue, which is available.
Thank you for that response. Well, in closing, let me just say we've had great participation here, certainly from the witnesses, but also from the members in person and remotely. I'm grateful for all that. Grateful to our staffs for pulling together the great panel. And this is not an easy issue. It's the first time we've had a hearing on it in like almost 6 years, and it's long overdue. And it's been helpful for me, and my hope it's been helpful from some of my colleagues. Some way we've raised as many issues and questions as we've answered, but it's a good start. And again, this is one of the hallmarks of this committee is we work together, we work across party lines, and we try to get to yes as often as we can and find a consensus. But I want to thank you all for joining us today. If done correctly, renewable fuels help safeguard our nation's energy security, boost economic opportunity for our farmers, and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. I look forward to continuing our conversation and working with members of our committee, our colleagues in the Senate, and other stakeholders to improve the Renewable Fuel Standard Program. And as we look to the future of the program, I believe we can encourage even greater sustainability for the fuels that empower our lives. Before we adjourn, some housekeeping. Senators will be allowed to submit written questions for the record through the close of business on Wednesday, March 2nd. We'll compile those questions, panel, and we'll send them to you. And we'll ask you to respond, if you will, by Wednesday, March 16th. And with that, this hearing is adjourned.